The first time Noah Carson walked away from the Broken Spur Ranch, he was 22 years old, standing in a foot of early snow with his father's freshly dug grave behind him, and a mortgage notice folded in his coat pocket like a death sentence. He had not cried at the funeral. He had not cried when the banker from Abilene rode out 3 days after to explain, with a politician's thin smile, that the ranch debt had accumulated well beyond what the land and cattle combined were worth. He had not cried when he saddled his horse, a gray roan named Smoke, and rode north toward Wichita with the absolute conviction that the Broken Spur could rot into the Kansas earth for all he cared. He was 22 and bone-tired, and certain that the land that had swallowed his father whole would not get the chance to swallow him. That was 1881. He came back 8 months later because there was nowhere else on God's earth that was his. Wichita had taught him that lesson quickly and without sentiment. He had worked cattle drives, slept in bunkhouses with men who smelled of whiskey and old sin, and discovered that belonging to a place, even a broken one, was the only kind of wealth that a man without education or connections was ever likely to hold. He paid the mortgage down over 3 years, rebuilt the fence lines his father had let fall, learned to keep books, which his father had never bothered to do. The Broken Spur began to breathe again. The second time Noah Carson walked away, he was 26, and a woman was involved, as people who knew him later said it was bound to be. Her name was Clara Vane, and she had come west from St. Louis with ideas about what a ranch life should look like that bore no relation whatsoever to what it actually was. She had been pretty and decisive, and she had told him she would marry him if he sold the ranch and use the money to open a dry goods store in Dodge City. He had almost done it. He had ridden into Dodge with a letter of inquiry in his saddlebag and spent 3 days looking at a narrow storefront on the main street, trying to imagine himself behind a counter weighing flour and selling ribbon. On the 4th morning he got back on Smoke and rode south, and when he arrived at the ranch, he found that Clara Vane had already left for the eastbound train. There was no letter. There was no scene. There was just a space where she had been and the quiet understanding that some deals could not be made. He did not see that second leaving as a failure. He saw it as a near miss, the way a man might look back at a bridge that had collapsed the moment after he crossed it. The third time was harder because by then he was 30, and the drought had lasted 2 full years. The summer of 1889 in Kansas was a biblical thing, the kind of heat that made intelligent men question their choices and foolish men pray. The cattle lost weight faster than Noah could manage. The creek that crossed the northwest corner of his land went dry in July, which had never happened in the 30 years anyone could remember. He sold off half his herd at prices that made him sick to record in his ledger. He let go of his 2 hired hands because he could not afford their wages. He was alone on 340 acres, and the land looked back at him like an accusation. That third time he did not ride north or toward any city. He simply stopped. He stopped doing the repairs. He stopped checking the creek bed. He stopped mending the south fence where the wire had snapped in a windstorm. He let the garden his mother had planted 20 years before go to seed. He sat on the porch in the evenings and drank more than he should and stared at the horizon with the particular emptiness of a man who has run out of reasons. He had his horse saddled and his bedroll packed on a Tuesday morning in September of 1889, ready to ride to his cousin Dale's place in Colorado, when the widow Hartley from the neighboring property sent her 12-year-old boy over with a message that 2 of Noah's cattle had gotten through the broken south fence and were eating her garden. He went to retrieve the cattle. He fixed the fence while he was at it. By the time he was done, it was late afternoon and the light on the Kansas grassland was the color of hammered copper, and he stood there looking at it, and the thing that happened was not dramatic or spiritual or even particularly clear. He just did not leave that day, or the next, or the one after. The drought broke in October with 3 days of hard rain. Noah Carson was 33 years old in the spring of 1892, and he was not a man who invited conversation about his inner life. The other ranchers in Barton County knew him as dependable and fair, a man who showed up to help brand calves or pull a wagon out of the mud without being asked, but who did not linger for the social parts of neighboring. He was lean and dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same prairie hardwood as his fence posts. His face was not unpleasant, but it was the kind of face that had stopped expecting things, which gave it a stillness that some people found comforting and other people found difficult to read. His ranch had recovered, not spectacularly, but honestly. He ran about 70 head of cattle now, maintained the property himself with occasional help from a young man named Pete Garza who came over 2 or 3 days a week. The house was plain but sound, the fences were good, and the well had never gone dry except in the worst of the drought years. He had a kitchen garden, a small apple orchard his mother had started, and a root cellar stocked well enough to see him through a hard winter. By the standards of 1892 in central Kansas, Noah Carson was not failing. He was simply alone, which was different from failing, though at a certain age and in certain lights it could look the same. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon in April of 1892, delivered by the postmaster's boy who rode out to the outlying properties twice a week. Noah was replacing a gate hinge when the boy arrived, and he took the letter and stuffed it in his shirt pocket and forgot about it until after supper when he found it while hanging up his work shirt. The envelope was addressed in a careful, upright handwriting that suggested someone who had learned their letters from a serious teacher. The return address was Galveston, Texas. The name above it was Ida Bell. He stood in his kitchen with his shirt in one hand and the envelope in the other, and tried to remember if he knew anyone in Galveston, Texas. He did not. He opened the letter. She had written to him through the Barton County Matrimonial Correspondence Agency, which was a service Noah had enrolled in 2 years prior during a bout of practical thinking that had lasted about 3 weeks before he forgot about it entirely. He had filled out a form describing himself and his circumstances and had sent it off with 50 cents and then proceeded to think no more about it. Apparently, the agency had not forgotten about him. Ida Bell wrote in the same careful, upright hand that appeared on the envelope. She was 24 years old. She had been born and raised in Galveston. Her parents were both dead, her father from yellow fever in 1886 and her mother from a fever the following winter, and she had since been working as a seamstress for a dressmaker on Market Street. She was not, she wrote with an honesty that stopped Noah mid-sentence, writing because she was desperate, though she acknowledged that might be difficult to believe given the circumstances. She was writing because she wanted something different. She had seen enough of Galveston. She wanted land that belonged to her, or at least to a family she was part of. She wanted to be useful in a way that a seamstress in a dress shop was not, though she was grateful for the work. She did not know anything about cattle ranching, but she said that with a matter-of-factness that implied she expected to learn. She could cook, sew, keep accounts, and she had once helped her uncle reset a broken fence line on his small farm outside the city, so she was not, she said, entirely ignorant of outdoor work. She asked 2 questions at the end of the letter. The first was whether his land actually produced enough to sustain 2 people. The second was whether he was a kind man. Noah read the letter twice. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a while. Then he went to the small writing desk in the parlor that had been his mother's and found paper and a pen and wrote back. He answered both of her questions directly. Yes, the ranch produced enough for 2 people, and in good years somewhat more than that. As to the second question, he wrote that he honestly was not certain whether kindness was a quality a man could accurately assign to himself, but that he had never in his life raised a hand to a woman or an animal, that he kept his word, and that he was capable of long silences that some people found disagreeable. He told her about the ranch, about the 70 head, the apple orchard, the garden. He told her the house had 2 bedrooms and a parlor and a kitchen with a good iron stove. He told her the nearest town was a place called Larned, which had a church, a dry goods store, a doctor, and a small school. He did not tell her about the 3 times he had thought about leaving. He was not certain why he left that out, only that it seemed like something to tell a person in person rather than in a letter. He mailed the letter on Saturday and spent the following week telling himself he probably would not hear back. He heard back in 11 days. She asked more questions. Was he religious? Did he drink heavily? What was the winter like? Did he have neighbors? He answered all of them. He was not religious in the church-going sense, but he believed in a kind of order to things. He drank sometimes in the evenings, he wrote, but not to excess and not every night. The winters were cold and could be hard, but the house was well insulated and there was always enough wood. His nearest neighbor was the widow Hartley, 3/4 of a mile east, who was a good woman, and had once sent her boy over to warn him about his fence. He found himself, in writing that second letter, going into more detail than he intended. He described the way the apple orchard looked in April, which was right now, white with blossom and loud with bees. He described the sound the cattle made in the early morning before feeding. He had not described those things to anyone in years because there had been no one to describe them to, and he noticed as he wrote that the ranch was a place he could talk about with something that was not yet hope, but was at least the cousin of it. She wrote again. They were exchanging letters every 10 to 14 days by May. And by June Noah was walking to the end of his lane on the days the postmaster's boy came out. In July she asked him, in language that was direct without being forward, whether he was still interested in meeting. He wrote back the same day. She arrived at the Larned train station on a Wednesday morning in August of 1892 on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, traveling second class with a trunk, a smaller bag, and a carpetbag she carried herself. Noah had driven into Larned the night before and slept at the boarding house because he was not going to make a woman wait while he drove in from the ranch. He was at the station platform 40 minutes before the train arrived, which was not something he intended to tell anyone. He wore his best shirt, which was clean and pressed and only slightly faded at the collar. He had brushed his hat. He had shaved that morning in the boarding house washroom with particular attention. The train was not particularly impressive by the standards of the eastern cities, but the sight and sound of it arriving at Larned's modest platform still had a kind of authority, steam and iron, and the smell of coal smoke rolling over the dry August air. People got off and were met by people, the ordinary human collision of travel and arrival, and Noah stood back slightly and watched the passengers come down the steps. He recognized her before she turned to face him directly, and he was not entirely sure how. She was shorter than he had imagined from her letters, with dark brown hair pinned up under a pale blue bonnet that had traveled hard but been cared for. She was wearing a practical traveling dress in gray-blue cotton that was neither fine nor shabby. She had a carpetbag in each hand, and she stepped off the train and stood on the platform with the composed alertness of someone who has arrived somewhere important and intends to get her bearings before she does anything else. Then she looked up and their eyes met, and he thought, with the odd clarity that sometimes comes in important moments, that she was going to be difficult to deceive and that this was probably a good thing. He crossed to her. "Miss Bell, Mr. Carson." She looked at him steadily, brown eyes level and curious. "You came early." "Yes." He did not explain that. He reached for her bags. She let him take one of the carpet bags but kept the other herself, and he noticed and filed it away. "Is this all your luggage?" he asked. "There's a trunk in the freight car. It has my sewing things and my books and my winter clothes." He arranged for the trunk to be held at the station while they arranged transport, then walked her to where he had left his wagon on the main street, which was not a long walk in Larned. She looked at the town as they walked, not nervously but with genuine attention, the way a person looks at a place they are considering seriously rather than one they are simply passing through. "Smaller than I expected," she said. Most things out here are smaller than people expect, he said. The land is the exception. She looked at him sideways at that. The corner of her mouth moved. They had dinner at the single restaurant Larned offered before setting out for the ranch. It was a plain meal, roast beef and boiled potatoes and bread, but it was hot and served without pretension, and they talked more easily than Noah had expected. She asked about his cattle, and he told her about the recent calving season, which had gone well. He asked about her journey from Galveston, and she described the train connections with an efficiency that suggested she had organized the trip herself without help. She had come through San Antonio and then north through Fort Worth and then west on the Santa Fe line, 3 days of travel in total. "Were you nervous?" he asked, and then regretted it as a question that was too close to the thing neither of them was saying directly, which was that they were strangers about to make a permanent arrangement. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I was practical about it," she said. "I thought carefully about whether your letters gave me reason to trust you. I decided they did. That was enough to get me on the train. The rest of the nervous feeling I took as being alive and paying attention." "That seems like a good way to handle it," he said. "It was the only way I knew," she said simply, and picked up her bread. They drove out to the ranch in the afternoon heat, the wagon moving at the patient pace of a team of horses that knew the road, and Ida Bell sat beside him on the bench and looked at the Kansas grassland with an expression he could not quite read. It was not disappointment and it was not wonder exactly. It was something more like recognition, as if the landscape matched some internal picture she had been working with. "It's flat," she said. "Very," he agreed. "I can see weather coming from miles away," she said, and it sounded like she meant this as something positive. "From about 20 miles in clear conditions," he said. She nodded as if this were useful information to have, and they drove on. The Broken Spur came into view in the late afternoon, the house and outbuildings settled in the slight depression where the creek ran, the apple orchard to the north of the house, the cattle visible as dark shapes on the open pasture to the west. The house was not pretty in any architectural sense, but it was solid, whitewashed the previous spring, with a porch that ran the full width of the front. There was a row of sunflowers along the porch steps that had seeded themselves from his mother's original plantings, and that Noah had never had the heart to pull. Ida Bell got down from the wagon before he could help her and stood looking at the house and the yard with her hands at her sides. He watched her face. "The sunflowers were not my doing," he said. "They seed themselves." "I know how sunflowers work," she said, but without any edge to it. "I like them." She paused. "I like the whole of it, actually. It looks like a place that has been lived in." "For about 30 years," he said. "Good," she said, and walked toward the porch. He showed her through the house, which he had cleaned with an attention to detail that he later recognized as a form of hope. The kitchen, the parlor with its plain furniture, the 2 bedrooms. He explained, with a matter-of-factness that he worked at, that she could have the larger bedroom to herself for as long as she wished, and that there was no expectation of anything until she was comfortable. She listened to this without embarrassment, and said she appreciated being told that directly. They had a simple supper that evening, eggs and bread and preserved peaches from the root cellar, and sat on the porch afterward, while the August dark came down over the grassland, and the first stars appeared. The crickets were loud. A coyote called from somewhere far out on the flats and then went quiet. "The letters were easier," he said at last. She laughed. It was a small laugh, but a real one. "Yes," she said, "but this is better. I can see your face when you don't say something." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that useful?" "With a man who doesn't say a great deal, very," she said. The first weeks were an education in proximity. They were courteous with each other, careful in the way that 2 people are when they are learning the specific geography of each other's daily life. Ida Bell took over the kitchen not aggressively but completely, and within a week, the meals were substantially better than anything Noah had produced in 3 years of solitary cooking. She found the account books on the second day and asked his permission to look at them, and then spent an evening going through them with the focused concentration of someone who knew numbers. She made 2 observations about his cattle record-keeping that turned out to be correct, and that saved him from a mistake he would have made at the fall cattle sale. She was not soft, was the thing he noticed first. She was not the kind of woman who required managing or reassurance. She was clear in her opinions and she did not soften them unnecessarily, but she was also genuinely curious about things, about the ranch and the animals and the neighboring families and the history of the land, and she asked questions with a directness that was not rudeness but simply efficiency. She had learned, he thought, to be efficient with her energy, which was something that life had taught her rather than something that had been natural. He found himself talking more than he had in years. Not performing conversation, but actually talking about the ranch, about the history of the land, about the water rights dispute he had with the Jennings family 2 properties north. She listened, and then said things that were either useful or funny and occasionally both. He discovered that she had a dry wit that she deployed so understatedly that you could miss it if you were not paying attention, and that he had very quickly started paying close attention. He drove her to Sunday service at the Larn Church at the end of the 2nd week, partly because it was the decent thing to do, and partly because he wanted to introduce her to the community in a context that was public and clear. The people of Larn received Ida Bell with the particular combination of curiosity and reserve that small Western communities apply to newcomers, and she received their attention without flinching. She shook hands with the minister, Mrs. Hartley, the neighboring widow, the Garza family whose son Pete worked for Noah, and a dozen others, and she said the right things to each person, which Noah noticed were different and specific rather than a single polite performance repeated. Afterward, driving home, she said, "Mrs. Hartley looked at me to see if I was good enough for you. She has decided to be protective of me," Noah said. "She was my mother's friend." "What did you decide she decided?" Ida Bell asked. He thought about it. "That the jury is still out, but she is inclined to give you a chance." "Good," said Ida Bell. "I like a fair jury." The thing that changed, or rather the thing that began to be clear, was not a single moment. It was a series of them, accumulated like rain in a barrel, each small drop insufficient by itself, but together making something you could use. It was her sitting at the kitchen table on a September morning with the account books and a cup of coffee and the early light falling across her face, wholly absorbed, the pencil moving with certainty. It was her standing in the orchard in the October cold with her arms full of apples, laughing at something one of the apples had apparently done. It was the way she handled a situation with a difficult heifer that had gotten her leg caught in the fence line, calm and low-voiced and practical while Noah worked the wire free, steadying the animal with a hand on its flank and a murmured continuous stream of reassurance. She had learned that from watching him, he realized. She had watched how he handled the cattle and simply done it herself when the moment required it. It was the evening in late September when she sat across the supper table and told him, without preamble, about her father's death from yellow fever when she was 18. The yellow fever outbreak of 1886 had been devastating in Galveston, and he had known about it in the abstract way one knows about disasters in distant places. But she told it close and specific, the way it had actually been, and he listened without saying the wrong things, which was mostly about not saying too much of anything, just being there in the room while she said what she needed to say. Afterward she was quiet for a moment and then said thank you in a voice that made him understand she did not always have someone to say things to. "I know what that is," he said, "not having someone." She looked at him across the table and something settled between them, a kind of mutual recognition that was quieter and more durable than whatever had come before it. October came, and with it the necessity of preparing for winter, which was its own kind of intimacy because it required cooperation and planning and the honest accounting of what they had and what they needed. They went over the root cellar together, made a list, drove into Larn for supplies. He taught her how to bank the foundation of the house with earth to keep the cold out, a task that involved working together on opposite sides of the house with shovels and wheelbarrows, and which should have been tedious but was not. She asked him in the middle of this task, leaning on her shovel and looking at him with the directness he had come to think of as simply the way her face worked. "Noah, are you glad I came?" He stopped shoveling. He thought about it seriously because she had asked seriously. "Yes," he said. "More than I expected to be." She nodded at this as if he had answered a question she had not entirely been certain of. "Good," she said, "because I am glad too. I want us to be honest about that rather than just polite." "I prefer honesty," he said. "I know," she said. "That was one of the things I trusted in your letters." They stood there for a moment in the October afternoon with their shovels and the pale autumn light, and neither of them said anything more, but something had been established. It was not a declaration. It was more like a foundation being confirmed as solid, the way you tap a floorboard to be sure it will hold weight. In November, Noah rode north to speak with the county land office about a boundary dispute that had come to a head with the Jennings family. Samuel Jennings was a large, loud man who had moved into the county 2 years prior and had been making gradual encroachments on water access that was rightfully part of Noah's land grant. The situation had been simmering for months and had become, with the onset of winter and the reduced creek flow, a genuine problem. Noah rode to Larned and then north to the land office at Great Bend, and spent 2 days in meetings with the land office clerk, and then with the county recorder, producing his original deed, and the survey maps his father had recorded in 1871. It was tedious and difficult work, the kind of legal navigating that made Noah feel like he was operating in a language he had only partially learned, but he was persistent, and the documents were clear, and he came home with a certified copy of the boundary determination in his coat pocket. Ida Bell had been alone at the ranch for 2 days and had managed it without any evident difficulty. She had fed the cattle, broken the ice on the water troughs each morning, kept the fire, and done a substantial amount of mending that had been accumulating. When he rode in on the second evening, she had supper waiting and coffee, and she listened to the full account of the land office proceedings with genuine interest, and then told him he had handled it correctly, and should send a written notice to the Jennings family through the land office, rather than confronting Samuel Jennings directly, because the documentation would matter more than any conversation. He looked at her across the supper table with the lamp between them making the room warm against the November dark outside. "Where did you learn about land documentation?" "My uncle had a property dispute with a neighbor in Galveston County," she said. "He lost because he tried to handle it personally, and by the time he got the papers together the neighbor had the advantage. I was 17 and I watched it happen, and it seemed to me that the lesson was clear." "It was the right advice," he said. "I know," she said, and served him another spoon of beans in the matter-of-fact way she had. He wrote the letter the next day. Samuel Jennings came to no further trouble about the boundary that winter. There was an evening in late November when Pete Garza came by with a problem that turned into something Noah had not expected. Pete was 20 years old, the youngest son of a Mexican family who had been in Kansas for 2 generations, his grandfather having come north with the cattle drives and stayed. He was a good worker and a decent young man, and Noah trusted him. But Pete came to the door that evening in November with his hat in his hands, and an expression that was the specific combination of sheepish and alarmed that meant something had gone wrong. It emerged that Pete, in a moment of extremely poor judgment, had gotten into a card game in Larned 2 nights before with a man named Curl Dawson, who was a professional gambler passing through on the Santa Fe line. Pete had lost $22, which was more than a month of what Noah paid him, and had given Dawson a note on the promise of payment. Dawson had left Larned, but the note was a real debt, and Pete's father had found out about it, and there was now a family situation of considerable tension. Noah listened to all of this at the kitchen table with Ida Bell present, which Pete had not expected, and which had made him even more uncomfortable until she offered him coffee and said that she was good at keeping things to herself. "You did something foolish," Noah said to Pete when it was all out. "You know that." "Yes, sir," Pete said miserably. "The debt is real and needs to be paid. I will not lend you the money, but I will advance it against your wages, dollar by dollar, until it's cleared. You will work the extra days to cover it, and you will not go near a card game again for at least a year. Do you agree to that?" "Yes, sir," Pete said. "And you will go home tonight and tell your father the arrangement so he knows it is being handled." Pete nodded, finished his coffee, and left. Noah sat back in his chair and looked at the fire. "That was well done," Ida Bell said. "He's a good kid. He made a stupid mistake. You gave him a way out that kept his dignity intact," she said. "That matters." He looked at her. The firelight was doing something to her face that made it difficult to look away. "Is that what I did?" "Yes," she said. "You probably did not think of it in those words, but that is what it was." He found himself that night, lying in his room with the November wind moving outside, thinking about the length of time it had taken him to understand what it was to have a partner. Not a hired hand, not a neighbor, not a correspondent. A partner. Someone who was in the same room with the same information, and who brought their own thinking to it. He had not had that before. His father had had it in the years when his mother was alive, and Noah had been too young to understand what he was watching. Now he thought he understood it. He did not say any of this that night, but it was working in him, the way water works into rock. December came down hard. The first true blizzard of the winter arrived on a Thursday and kept them inside for 2 full days, the wind driving the snow horizontal across the flats. The cattle were sheltered in the main barn, which Noah and Pete had reinforced in November, and the horses were in the smaller barn, and the house was warm and tight against the storm. Being confined together for 2 days was the most intimate thing that had happened between them yet. Not in any dramatic sense, but in the daily, accumulated sense of learning all the ways a person moves through the hours of a day. She read. She had a small collection of books in her trunk, novels and 1 volume on practical botany, and a Bible that had been her mother's, and she read with the same focused attention she brought to the account books. He worked on equipment in the parlor, cleaning and oiling harness and tools, a winter task he usually found dreary, and that was not dreary with her there. They talked and were quiet in turns without the quiet being uncomfortable. On the second evening she put down her book and said, "Tell me why you almost left." He looked at her. "Left where?" "The ranch," she said. "I have gathered from small things you have said that you have thought about leaving more than once. I would like to know about it." He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved against the house and the fire crackled, and he thought about whether he was going to tell her this. 3 times, he said. She waited. He told her. He told her about his father's death and the mortgage notice, and riding north to Wichita at 22. He told her about Clara Vane and the dry goods store in Dodge City. He told her about the drought and the whiskey and the saddled horse and the widow Hartley's boy coming over about the cattle and the fence. She listened to all of it without interrupting except once when she asked a quiet question about his father. He answered it and went on. When he was finished, she was looking at him steadily. 3 times, she said. "Yes." "Why did you come back the first time?" "Because there was nowhere that was mine except here," he said. "Even Broken." She was quiet for a moment. "And the second?" "Because I knew the difference between a ranch and a dry goods store," he said. "And between a woman who wanted me and a woman who wanted something I could provide for her that any man with enough money could provide." Her expression shifted slightly. "And the third? Because a cow got through my fence," he said, "which sounds small, but I fixed the fence and the drought broke and I stayed. I'm not sure I can explain it better than that." "You can," she said. "The cow through the fence was just the thing that stopped the leaving. What made you want to stay was still here. You had not actually stopped caring about it. You had just run out of the energy to care." He stared at her. "Yes," he said slowly, "that is exactly what it was." "People confuse exhaustion with the end of love," she said. For a place or a person, the exhaustion passes, the love is still there underneath it. He looked at the fire for a while. How do you know that? Because I loved my mother until she died, and in the last year of her sickness I was so exhausted that there were days I resented her for needing me, she said. And I felt terrible about that. But after she was gone, I understood it differently. I had never stopped loving her. I had just been very tired. Those are not the same thing. He sat with that for a while. No, he said at last, they are not. She picked up her book again but did not open it. I am telling you this because I want you to know that if there is ever a fourth time, she said, you can tell me. You can tell me when you are exhausted. That is what another person is for. He could not think of the right thing to say to that, so he said the true thing. I'm not planning on a fourth time. I know, she said. I didn't think you were, but I wanted you to know it anyway. She opened her book. He went back to cleaning the harness. The fire burned down, and they added wood, and the blizzard ran itself out by morning. He proposed to her on a December morning 6 days before Christmas, standing in the apple orchard after they had gone out to check for storm damage from the recent blizzard. The trees were bare and gray against the white sky, and the snow was deep around them, and he had not planned to do it in this exact moment. But she was standing there looking up at one of the older trees with an expression of genuine concern for the tree, which was perhaps the most Ida Bell expression he had ever seen, and something in him simply arrived at certainty. Ida, he said. She turned. I want to ask you properly, he said, if you will marry me. She looked at him for a moment with that steady brown-eyed directness. You are not asking because it is practical. It is practical, he said. That is not why I'm asking. Why then? He thought about how to say it accurately. Because the ranch is a better version of itself when you are in it, he said. And so am I. She was quiet for long enough that he noticed. Then she said, yes, Noah, I will marry you. He had no ring. He had not thought to get one before the blizzard had made Larned inaccessible. He told her this with some embarrassment, and she told him the ring was not the important part. And they walked back to the house through the snow and had coffee, and neither of them felt the need to say much more about it for the rest of that day, which felt appropriate. They were married at the Larned Church on a Thursday in early January of 1893, in a ceremony attended by the minister, Mrs. Hartley, the Garza family in their entirety, and a handful of other neighboring families who had come to respect Ida Bell in the months since her arrival. It was cold, and the church was heated inadequately, and the ceremony was short and unadorned and entirely correct. She wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had made herself, and she had flowers, winter flowers that Mrs. Hartley had somehow produced from her root-cellar garden, small and pale but real. Noah wore his best suit, which was not very fine, and stood at the altar with the sensation of doing the most permanent thing he had ever done and feeling, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, that permanent was exactly what he wanted. When the minister asked him if he would take her to love and to keep, and Noah said, I will, he was not performing a ritual. He was stating a fact he had arrived at by a long and winding road, through absences and near misses and exhaustion and drought, through letters from Galveston and sunflowers that seeded themselves, and a fence he had not quite gotten around to leaving through. When the ring went on her finger, he had gotten it in Larned the week before the ceremony, a simple gold band from the dry goods store that had no jewels but was good solid gold. She looked up at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not surprised. It was more like satisfied, the way a person looks when something that they had hoped would be real turns out to actually be real. He kissed her, which in the Larned Church in 1893 was a modest business by any standard, and the minister shook his hand, and Mrs. Hartley embraced Ida and the Garza family, who were warm and demonstrative in ways that the Anglo neighbors were less comfortable with, produced food that they had brought in covered dishes, and there was an impromptu wedding meal at the church tables that lasted 2 hours and was unexpectedly joyful. They drove home in the late January afternoon, the sky the deep pale blue of winter Kansas, and the first stars appearing before they reached the ranch lane. She sat beside him on the wagon bench, closer than before, and his arm was around her shoulders against the cold, and they did not need to say anything particular because they were driving to the same place, and it was home for both of them now. That winter was a good one, in the particular sense that winter on a Kansas ranch can be good, hard and close and demanding, but with the quality of warmth inside the house that comes from two people genuinely wanting to be there. Noah had not had that quality in the house since his mother was alive, and he had forgotten what it felt like. He found himself relearning it steadily. Ida Bell was a formidable partner in the practical business of the ranch. She had learned the cattle by name and character in a way that sometimes surprised Pete Garza, who had worked the ranch for 2 years without bothering. She knew which animals were likely to cause trouble and which were reliably calm. She knew the quirks of the iron stove and the particular cold spots in the kitchen floor, and the way the south fence always loosened in the freeze-thaw of late winter. She kept the accounts with a precision that was revelatory to Noah, who had kept accounts adequately but not well, and by February she had identified 3 places where the ranch could reduce costs without reducing output, and had suggested 2 ways to improve the cattle management for the spring calving season that turned out to be correct. He told her one evening that she was better at the ranch management than he was. "That's not true," she said, from across the table. "You understand the land and the cattle in a way I am still learning. I am better at the numbers and the planning. That seems like it evens out. That is the point of 2 people," she said, and went back to the ledger. In early February, a situation arose with Samuel Jennings that tested both of them. Jennings, apparently emboldened by the winter and possibly by whiskey, rode onto Noah's property on a Sunday afternoon and cut the north fence line in 2 places, presumably to move his cattle to the creek access during a cold snap. Noah found the cut fence the next morning when he went to check on the cattle and found 3 of his animals had gotten out, and 2 of Jennings's cattle were in his pasture near the creek. He was, for about 20 minutes, very angry. Ida Bell found him fixing the fence in a silence that she accurately identified as controlled fury. She helped him fix the fence without speaking, and when it was done and they were walking back to the house, she said, "What are you going to do?" "I need to go and speak to Jennings," he said. "Yes. Do you want me to come?" He thought about it. "No, but I want you to help me decide what to say." They sat at the kitchen table and she helped him think it through. The legal ground was clear. The boundary determination from November gave him unambiguous standing. The question was how to handle Jennings in a way that was firm without escalating unnecessarily, because Jennings was a difficult man but not inherently vicious, and an enemy in the neighboring county was a thing to be avoided if it was avoidable. "Tell him what happened plainly without accusation," she said. "Show him the paperwork. Give him a chance to say it was a mistake, even if you both know it was not. Then be clear about what will happen if it occurs again. And if he is not reasonable, then you have the documentation and you have the law and you use them," she said. "But give him the first chance to be reasonable." Noah rode to the Jennings place that afternoon. It was not a comfortable meeting. Samuel Jennings was a man with a wide face and a confrontational quality, the kind of man who experienced the existence of boundaries as a personal insult. But Noah had the paperwork and he had thought the conversation through, and he presented both the facts and the offer of a reasonable resolution without raising his voice. Jennings grumbled and blustered and ultimately, facing the clarity of the legal documentation, agreed to compensate Noah for the fence repair and to respect the boundary. He was not friendly when Noah left, but the immediate problem was resolved and the more significant boundary remained secure. Ida Bell listened to the account that evening without comment until he was done and then said, "That was well done. You helped me do it," he said. "You went and had the conversation," she said. "That was yours." Spring of 1893 came in with the usual Kansas ambivalence, warm days followed by hard, cold nights, the ground thawing and refreezing, the creek running high with snowmelt. The cattle calving season was the busiest time of the ranch year, and Ida Bell threw herself into it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. She had been watching Noah and Pete work with the cattle all winter, and by March she was genuinely useful in the calving barn, steady and quiet with the animals, good at the long nights when a difficult birth required patience. She lost some sleep and got covered in things that no one would describe in polite company, and took all of it with a matter-of-factness that Pete Garza found inspiring, and that Noah found deeply moving, though he would not have used that particular word. The calving season of 1893 produced 61 live calves, which was the best result the Broken Spur had seen in 5 years. Noah recorded it in the ledger in his careful hand and then, for the first time, wrote both their names at the top of the page. Broken Spur Ranch. Noah and Ida Carson. It had not occurred to him to do it before, and it seemed to him, looking at it, like the most accurate thing he had written in some time. In May, Ida Bell told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with the straightforwardness that characterized all her important announcements, not as a surprise or a ceremony, but as a fact that she was reporting clearly. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for a moment they were both simply still with the weight of it. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I am well, and I expect to continue to be. I am not fragile." "I know you are not," he said. "I was asking because I wanted to know." She nodded. "I know. I will tell you when I am not well, I promise." He stood up and crossed to where she was standing and held her, carefully and for longer than was strictly necessary. She let him, which she did not always do with the particular ease of someone accustomed to being held. He felt her settle against him and held her a little longer. The pregnancy proceeded without incident through the summer, which Ida managed with characteristic efficiency, adjusting her work rather than stopping it. She was slower with heavy tasks, and she let Noah do the things that required lifting, and she continued the accounts and the planning and the kitchen and the garden with all the thoroughness she had always applied. Mrs. Hartley came over more frequently and took on an almost official role as advisor and confidant that Ida received with a warmth that she had not, in the early months, shown to many people. She and Mrs. Hartley had arrived at something genuine between them, founded on mutual directness and a shared practical sensibility. In August they drove to Larne together so Ida could see the doctor, who confirmed that everything was proceeding well and gave his assessment of the expected timing, which he placed at late November or early December. Noah drove home with this information sitting inside him like something enormous he had not yet figured out how to hold. "You are quiet," Ida said. "I'm thinking," he said. "About what?" He was quiet for another moment. "About what kind of father I will be," he said. I did not have the best example. She looked at him with a directness that had become over the past year the most comforting thing he knew. "What was your father like?" "He worked very hard," Noah said. "He was not cruel, but he did not know how to be present in the way that mattered. He was always somewhere else in his thinking, even when he was standing in front of you, and he kept things to himself, the worries and the difficulties, until they were too big to manage." "That is a specific thing to have learned from watching someone," she said. "I spent a lot of time trying to understand what had gone wrong," he said. She reached over and put her hand on his arm as he drove. Her hand was warm and steady. "You will not be that father," she said, "because you can say the sentence you just said to me. His problems probably could not have been said at all." He covered her hand with his own. The wagon moved on through the August heat, and the Kansas sky was enormous above them, and he thought, with a fullness in his chest that was not entirely comfortable because he was not used to it, that he had done the right thing in every one of the dozen choices that had led to this particular wagon on this particular road on this particular day. The harvest of 1893 was good. The cattle went to market in September at prices that were better than the previous year, and the ledger came out ahead of projections in a way that allowed Noah to make a significant payment on the remaining mortgage and to put aside a reserve against the next hard year, which always came eventually. He and Ida reviewed the books together in the evening, and she made the notations in her clear, upright hand, and he watched her face as she worked and thought he was the luckiest kind of fool, the kind who did not know what he had been missing until it arrived and stayed. Pete Garza was extended to 4 days a week in anticipation of the coming winter and Ida's diminishing mobility in the final weeks of her pregnancy. Pete had cleared his debt from the card game by September and had recovered his natural good humor and energy, and he worked with an increased investment in the ranch that Noah recognized as the particular loyalty of a young man who has been given a fair chance when he did not deserve one. In late September, Noah found himself one evening, sitting on the porch after supper in the cool early autumn air, looking out at the pasture where his cattle moved in the fading light. He was looking at the fence lines he had mended and the barn he had reinforced, and the orchard that was heavy with its last apples of the season, and the house at his back that was warm and lit and had Ida in it, and he was aware with a clarity that was not dramatic but was complete that he was not going anywhere. Not because he was trapped, because this was his. All of it. The land and the work and the difficulty and the beauty of it on evenings like this one. And Ida, who was not a reason he stayed in the way of a chain or a lock, but in the way of a thing that made the staying its own reward. She had not saved him from leaving. He had already turned from the door before she came. But she had given the staying a shape and a warmth and a future that made the first 3 near departures feel like exactly what they had been. A man circling back to the thing he could not actually leave behind. He thought about the 3 times. He thought about the night his father was buried. He thought about the drive to Dodge City with Clara Vane's impossible terms in his pocket. He thought about the saddled horse and the widow Hartley's boy and the fence and the copper evening light and the rain that had come in October like a resolution. And then he thought about a letter arriving from Galveston, Texas, in an upright, careful hand. About a woman who had stepped off a train in Larned, Kansas, with a carpetbag in each hand, and taken a look at the flat Kansas horizon, and called it beautiful in the particular way of someone who meant it as a geographical fact rather than a reassurance. He was still sitting there when the door behind him opened, and Ida came out and sat beside him in the other porch chair with the cup of tea she usually had in the evenings. She sat and looked at the same view he had been looking at and said nothing, which was one of the 1,000 things about her he had come to love. "I was thinking about the ranch," he said. "I guessed," she said. "Specifically, I was thinking about the fact that I am not leaving." She turned her head and looked at him with a small smile that he knew by now was the smile that meant she was more moved than she was going to let on directly. "Is that a new conclusion?" "No," he said. "It is a confirmed one." She reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his the way she did sometimes in the evenings when they were sitting together. "Good," she said. "Because I have some extensive plans for that apple orchard, and they require you to be here." He laughed, which was something he did more often now, and held her hand, and they sat there until the stars came out, and the Kansas night wrapped itself around the Broken Spur Ranch in the deep dark quiet of a place that was genuinely, completely, permanently inhabited. Their son was born on the 1st of December, 1893, on a night of light snow, delivered by the doctor from Larned who had ridden out in the cold without complaint. Noah stayed in the house, which was not entirely the custom in the county at the time, but which both he and Ida had agreed on well in advance, and he was in the kitchen when his son arrived into the world with a voice that announced itself with clarity through the bedroom door. They named him James, after Ida's father, which was Noah's suggestion. She had looked at him when he suggested it with the expression she had when something surprised her in a way she had not expected from him, a slightly widened focus in her eyes, and then she had simply said yes. James Carson was a solid, healthy, loud-voiced boy who slept in the wooden cradle that Noah built in November, and who reorganized the entire domestic life of the Broken Spur Ranch from the moment of his arrival. He was demanding and curious and particular in the way of infants who intend to become interesting people, and Noah held him on the first evening with the careful terror of a man holding something irreplaceable, and looked at his son's face, and was visited by the specific, permanent love that has no useful language, and that he had not known he was capable of until it was already there. Ida recovered from the birth with characteristic efficiency, back to the account books within 10 days at Mrs. Hartley's strong objection, and managing the infant and the house and the ranch records with a capacity for organization that continued to astound everyone who observed it. Mrs. Hartley came over 3 days a week through December and January, and became so thoroughly woven into the life of the house that Noah began to set a place for her at supper as a matter of course. The winter of 1893 into 1894 was cold but not brutal, and the ranch came through it in better shape than any winter Noah could remember managing alone. He and Ida sat by the fire in the evenings with James asleep in the cradle between them and talked about the coming year, about the cattle and the fence repairs needed, and the expansion of the garden, and the possibility of adding a second water tank in the east pasture. They talked about wanting another child, eventually, when the time felt right. They talked about whether Pete Garza might want to come on full-time, because the ranch was growing to the point where the work was more than Noah could manage alone. They talked the way two people talk who have stopped being careful around each other and started being honest, which is a different and better thing. He told her about his mother, who he had not talked about to anyone in years. She told him about what it had been like to grow up in a city, the particular texture of a Galveston childhood before the fever years, the smell of the Gulf, the way the summer heat in Texas was different from the summer heat in Kansas, wet rather than dry, like walking through warm breath. He told her about the year on the cattle drives, the bunkhouses, the particular kind of freedom that belonged to no one and led nowhere. She told him about the dressmaker on Market Street who had been hard but fair, and from whom she had learned more than sewing, an understanding of what it meant to run a business, which was a thing she applied daily to the ranch without ever having named it as such until now. The following spring, 1894, Noah made the final payment on the Broken Spur mortgage. He had been carrying some portion of his father's debt for 11 years, and the moment the payment was made, and the paper was signed at the Larned Bank and the mortgage was discharged, he sat in his wagon in front of the bank and held the discharge document, and thought about his father in the way you can sometimes think about a person after you have finished something they started, with both tenderness and the particular finality of accounts that are settled. He told Ida when he got home. She was in the garden with James on a blanket nearby, at 8 months, a person of definite opinions about the outside world. She stood up and looked at him and read the document, and then she said simply, "Your father would have been glad. He thought about that." "I think he would," he said. She handed the document back and looked at him with the fullness of someone who understands the weight of a thing. "It is yours now," she said. "Entirely yours." "Ours," he said. She accepted this with a nod that was both modest and utterly certain. "Ours," she agreed. The summer of 1894 was the kind of summer the Kansas grassland occasionally produces as an apology for its harder seasons. Generous and golden, with rain that came reliably enough and heat that was strong without being punishing. The cattle were fat and the garden was extravagant, and the apple orchard produced more fruit than they could use in a year, which meant Ida spent 3 weeks in August making preserves in quantities that filled a significant portion of the root cellar, and filled the house with a smell that Noah decided was his favorite smell on earth. Pete Garza came on full-time in July, and they agreed on a wage that was fair for both parties. Pete was now 22, and had stopped making foolish decisions about card games and had become, over 2 years of working the Broken Spur, genuinely skilled with cattle in a way that relieved Noah of considerable daily worry. He worked with an investment that came from feeling that the ranch's success was partly his, which it was. Ida began teaching herself about the orchard in a serious way, borrowing books from the learned schoolteacher on fruit cultivation and soil management, asking questions of the older farmers in the area who had been growing trees in the Kansas climate for 20 years. She had a plan to expand the orchard with 2 additional varieties that she said would extend the fruiting season from late summer well into October, which would mean both more fresh fruit and more material for preserving. Noah spent 2 Saturdays in August helping her prepare the new planting area and ordered the young trees from a nursery in Kansas City. He watched her directing the planting with the plan she had sketched in her notebook and thought that this was exactly what she had said she wanted, standing in the Larned restaurant on the first day she arrived, looking at the flat landscape and deciding it was what she was after. Something useful, something that grew, something that was hers to tend. In September of 1894, Ida told him she was pregnant again. He received this news with considerably more joy and somewhat less terror than the first time, which he thought was progress. Their daughter was born in April of 1895, a spring child who arrived with the apple blossoms, which Ida said was appropriate and Noah chose to believe was not an accident. They named her Rose, which was Ida's mother's name, and she was from her first week on Earth the kind of person who required you to pay close attention, with Ida's direct gaze and what Noah suspected was going to be her mother's particular brand of clear-eyed assessment of the world. She was loved from the moment of her arrival, with the uncomplicated thoroughness of a family that had room for her. James, at 2 years old, received his sister with the magnanimous suspicion of a small person who has been the center of things and is not entirely convinced by the offered replacement. But by summer he was teaching Rose, who could not yet sit independently, about the cattle, which he did by pointing through the kitchen window and naming each animal in the particular mangled vocabulary of a 2-year-old. And it was both completely uninformative and entirely genuine. And Noah and Ida watched it from across the kitchen table and looked at each other with the specific look that has no word in English, but that means everything is exactly as it should be. The autumn cattle sale of 1895 was the best the Broken Spur had ever produced, 92 animals going to market at good prices. The increased herd size a result of 3 years of careful management, and the good calving seasons of 1893 and 1894. The ledger at the end of that year showed the ranch in genuine prosperity, not wealth by any grand standard but sufficient, solid, growing, the kind of numbers that meant they could plan forward with confidence rather than backward with anxiety. Noah sat with the closed ledger on the kitchen table on a November evening and thought about the first time he had looked at account books after his father's death and seen only debt. He thought about learning to keep books properly. He thought about Ida sitting across from him that first September, her pencil moving with certainty, and the 2 observations she had made that first evening that had been entirely correct. He reached across the table and took her hand where she was reading her book. She looked up. "I want to tell you something," he said. She closed the book. "Tell me." "When I was 22, he said, "I thought the ranch was what was keeping me from having a life. It took me a long time to understand that it was the life, and it took you arriving to understand that the life could be this." She looked at him for a long moment with the brown-eyed steadiness he had loved since the first day on the station platform in Larned. "I want to tell you something too," she said. "Tell me." "When I wrote that first letter," she said, "I was honest when I said I was not desperate, but I was lonely in a way I did not have good language for. I had been alone for a long time, and I was managing it well, and I did not want to be pitied for it. What I did not know how to say was that I wanted someone to be alongside, not to take care of me or to be taken care of, just to be alongside. And," he said, "and you are that," she said simply. "You have been that from the beginning." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the specific gesture of a man who does not always have the exact right words but knows the right way to hold a thing. She turned her hand and held his back, and they sat there in the kitchen of the Broken Spur Ranch with the fire going and the children asleep and the November wind outside and the lamplight making the room amber and warm, and it was ordinary in the best possible way, the way that means it is going to last. The years that followed were the years of a life being fully lived. James grew into a serious, capable boy who was particularly gifted with horses, a talent that Pete Garza, who spent considerable time teaching him the basics, attributed to James having absorbed the ranch from infancy in the way children absorb language. By the time James was 6, he was riding confidently on the small mare Noah had acquired specifically for him, and by 8 he was helping with the cattle in real and useful ways. He had his mother's exactness and his father's patience, a combination that gave him a character that the people of Larned found reassuring in a young person. Rose grew into someone else entirely, which was appropriate. She had Ida's directness and something additionally her own, a bright curiosity about the natural world that led her from the age of 3 to collect things, rocks and feathers and dried grasses and the occasional confused beetle, and to have opinions about them that were, when she was old enough to articulate them, surprisingly well-reasoned. Ida gave her access to the botany book that had traveled from Galveston in the trunk, and Rose read it at 6 with an attention that was entirely genuine. Mrs. Hartley, who had become so central to the family by this time that the children called her grandmother Hartley, without anyone having formally arranged this title, said that Rose reminded her of a professor she had once known, which was the highest compliment she typically dispensed. In the spring of 1897, Ida expanded the orchard with a 3rd variety of apple tree, and also planted a substantial kitchen garden extension specifically for growing medicinal herbs, which had been a project she had been researching for 2 years. She had become, in the 5 years since her arrival at the Broken Spur, something of a resource for the neighboring families on practical matters, particularly regarding the kitchen garden and food preservation. And the herb garden was partly for the family, and partly for the community in the quiet way that such things happen among people who are genuinely neighbors rather than simply adjacent. Noah, watching her with her notebook and her careful planting diagrams, thought about the seamstress on Market Street in Galveston who had taught her to run a business without naming it that, and thought that Ida Bell had always known what she was capable of, but had simply needed the space to do it. He told her this one evening. She put down her notebook and looked at him with an expression that was complicated in a way he had learned to read as something she was deciding whether to say. "That is possibly the kindest thing you have said to me," she said at last. "I should say kind things more often," he said. "You say them when they are true," she said. "That is better." They had a 3rd child in 1898, a boy they named Samuel, which was not after Samuel Jennings but after Ida's maternal grandfather, a coincidence of names that amused them privately. Samuel arrived in July on a hot Kansas morning, and was from the first hour a sunny, uncomplicated baby who seemed to find the world generally satisfactory, which was a relief and a delight in equal parts. James, at 5, was a serious and thorough older brother. Rose, at 3, found Samuel wonderful in the specific way of a child who is old enough to be a person, but young enough to still require admiration of a baby as a pure and unironic pleasure. Noah held Samuel on the evening of his birth, while Ida slept and looked at his son's face in the lamplight and thought about the word abundance, which he had always associated with crops and cattle and ledger numbers, but which he now understood was primarily about the people in a room with you. He thought about the 3 times. He thought about them the way a man touches a scar, not painfully, but as a reminder of what had been and what had been survived and what had been transformed. The first leaving, the mortgage notice and his father's grave and the road north to Wichita. The second, the dry goods store and the woman who wanted the ranch money rather than the man. The third, the drought and the whiskey and the saddled horse and the fence. 3 times he had stood at the door. 3 times something had brought him back, and the last time it was Ida Bell in a letter in careful upright handwriting from Galveston, Texas, asking two entirely reasonable questions about whether he was solvent and whether he was kind. He had told her once, in the December blizzard, that he was not planning on a fourth time. He could say it now with an assurance that had nothing to do with planning and everything to do with the fact that you do not leave the center of a thing. You do not walk away from the place where your life is actually happening. He had circled the center for a decade before he knew where it was, and now he knew. It was here, this house, this land, these children and this woman who had looked at the flat Kansas horizon on an August afternoon and said it was exactly what she had come for. Samuel made a small sound in his arms and settled deeper into sleep. Ida breathed steadily in the next room. Outside, the summer dark lay across the broken spur, the cattle moving quietly in the near pasture, the apple orchard standing in the still air, the fence lined straight and good. He put his son gently in the cradle and stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen with the lamp turned low, and thought that a man who had the sense to stay, when it mattered, had everything he needed. The years continued to be good years, or rather they continued to be real years, with the mixture of difficulty and joy and ordinary work that constitutes an actual life as opposed to a wished-for one. There were hard winters and a disappointing calving season in 1899, and a late frost in 1900 that damaged the orchard substantially, which Ida managed with a combination of grief and practical restoration that had the trees recovering more completely than anyone expected within 2 seasons. There were good years, the cattle market strong in 1901 and 1902, the garden producing beyond their needs, the account books showing steady and genuine growth. Pete Garza, by 1900, had grown into a man of 28 with a wife of his own, a woman named Consuela from a family in Great Bend, and they had a son. Pete and Noah formalized their arrangement in 1901 so that Pete had a stake in the ranch, a formal share of ownership documented in the county records, which was something Noah had been thinking about for 2 years, and which Ida had said was exactly the right thing to do when he described it to her. Pete received this with a quiet that was everything. James Carson, at 12, was already the best young horseman in the county. He had his father's patience and his mother's precision, and he handled the animals with an authority that came from genuine understanding rather than force, a philosophy that Noah had never articulated but had always practiced, and that James had absorbed as if it were in the air of the ranch. He was going to be a remarkable rancher, which Noah saw clearly and said to Ida on a December evening, and Ida said yes, and also whatever else he wants to be, because there is a wide world and he should know it. Noah thought about this and agreed. Rose, at 10, had decided she was going to be a botanist, which was a word she had learned from one of the books Ida had ordered from a library in Topeka, and which she used with the confidence of someone who has found the right name for the thing she already knew she was. She kept notebooks of plant observations with a rigor that the Larned schoolteacher, a patient man named Mr. Evers who had taught for 20 years, said was genuinely beyond what he could offer her at this stage. Ida arranged, through correspondence with the normal school in Emporia, for Rose to receive supplementary education by mail, which the girl applied herself to with an intensity that made the kitchen table unavailable for supper on 2 occasions due to botanical specimens requiring extended examination. Samuel, at 2 going on 3, was still largely devoted to being sunny and satisfied, which the rest of the family found restoring. In the summer of 1901, Mrs. Hartley died quietly in her sleep in late June. She had been 64 years old and had been slowing through the spring in ways that were visible if you were watching, which Ida had been. She died as she had lived, without fuss, and her absence from the life of the Broken Spur was a specific loss, the kind that does not diminish and that you simply learn to carry as part of the weight of a life that has included something real. Ida spoke at the funeral at the Larned Church, which was not the custom, but which the minister permitted because everyone in attendance felt it was right. She spoke about what it meant to have a woman who had known Noah's mother become a friend to her, the particular continuity of it, one generation of women caring about the same household and the same land. She was clear and brief and dry-eyed until near the end, and then her voice caught once, which was the only time Noah had ever seen it do that in a public space. He was sitting in the pew with James on one side and Rose on the other and Samuel on his lap, and he watched his wife at the front of the church and thought about the word alongside, which she had used that November evening years before, and thought that the word applied in every direction. She had come to be alongside him. He had learned to be alongside her. They had been alongside each other through all the real things a life contains, and they would be alongside each other through whatever came after this. She came back to the pew, and he took her hand and she held it firmly, and they sat together while the minister concluded the service, and the June sunlight came through the church windows and lit the old wood of the pews to the color of honey. The early 1900s moved the country in directions that were felt even in Barton County, Kansas, and even on a ranch 3/4 of a mile from the nearest neighbor. The cattle market continued its fluctuations, which Noah and Ida managed with the account book discipline they had developed over a decade. The railroad made certain things easier and certain other things more competitive. There was talk of a new road through the county that would mean better access to land year-round, which would be materially significant for getting cattle to market without the autumn mud that could turn a straightforward task into a 3-day ordeal. Noah turned 43 in 1902 and felt it in his knees and his back in the mornings in a way he had not felt 20 years before, which was neither surprising nor tragic, but was simply the information his body was beginning to provide. He was still strong and capable of a full day of hard physical work, but he had learned from Ida to manage his energy across the day rather than exhausting it in the first hours, which she had observed him doing for years, and had eventually persuaded him was not efficiency but waste. Ida turned 34 that same year and was, in every material sense, in the middle of her life and fully inhabiting it. She had the herb garden and the expanded orchard and the account books and the children, and a correspondence with 2 women in Topeka. She had met through the County Agricultural Association who were, like her, managing substantial household operations on western ranches with the intelligence and organization those operations actually required. She had a reputation in the area for the kind of steady competence that is not exciting and is not meant to be, but that constitutes the actual backbone of a community. She had also, in the way of a woman who had grown up in a coastal city and lived for 10 years on the Kansas plains, developed a relationship with the land itself that was personal and particular, that was not romantic in the sentimental sense, but was deeply real. She knew the smell of rain coming from the west. She knew the sound the cattle made in a storm versus a normal night. She knew the way the apple trees looked when they were going to fruit well versus when they were stressed. The land had given her these pieces of knowledge over a decade of daily attention, and she held them the way she held anything she had worked for, with quiet satisfaction. One evening, in the fall of 1902, they were sitting on the porch after the children were in bed, which was a habit they had maintained through the years with the fidelity of people who understand that time alone together is not a luxury but a necessity. The evening was cool and clear, the stars large over the flat Kansas sky, the occasional sound of the cattle from the pasture, the particular night smell of the grassland that Noah had known all his life and Ida had learned over 10 years and now could not imagine not knowing. "I want to ask you something," Ida said. "Ask," he said. "Are you happy?" He turned to look at her. The question surprised him not because it was forward but because she rarely asked the large direct questions about the interior life, preferring to observe and infer. "Yes," he said, and then because she had asked directly and deserved an answer that was as direct. "I'm happier than I knew I could be. I mean that specifically. I did not know this was an available condition for me." She was quiet for a moment. "I ask because I want to make sure you know it," she said, "not because I am uncertain. I can see that you are, but I want you to say it out loud sometimes, for yourself." "Why for myself?" "Because you spend a long time not knowing it," she said. "And I want it to be a thing you have fully." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you happy?" She smiled, which was a wide and genuine smile, the kind she had shown him more and more over the years as the careful reserve of early days had given way to the comfort of being known. "Completely," she said. "I have told you before that this is what I came for. I meant it at the time, and I have meant it every day since." He reached over and put his arm around her, and she leaned against his shoulder in the way that was now so familiar that it was part of the shape of the evening. And they sat and watched the Kansas stars in comfortable silence, and the Broken Spur Ranch lay around them in the dark. The fences straight, and the cattle settled, and the orchard breathing quietly in the cool air, and the house at their backs warm and full of their children and their life. He thought, in the way that thoughts come on still evenings, about the ranch as it had been when he was young. The weight of it. The debt and the difficulty, and the way it had felt less like a home, and more like an obligation that had been handed to him by a man who did not know how to explain what it was worth. He thought about the 3 times the weight had become too much, the 3 times the road away had seemed more possible than the road forward. He thought about all the things that had happened in the years between, the fence mended and the drought survived, and the work and the loss and the recovery and the gradual slow-burning discovery that this place, this particular 340 acres of Kansas grassland and apple orchard and good creek water and difficult winters, was his in a way that went down to the bone. And he thought about the 4th reason. Not a dramatic thing, not a rescue or a revelation. A letter in upright, careful handwriting. A woman at a train station with a carpet bag in each hand who had looked at the flat land and said it was what she came for. A partnership built out of 2 people's particular capabilities and genuine honesty with each other. A life assembled together, year by year, season by season, out of the same material that everything lasting is made of. Work and care and the willingness to stay when staying is hard and the daily decision, remade so many times it becomes simply the shape of who you are, to be alongside the person and the place and the life that is yours. Noah Carson had given up on the Broken Spur Ranch 3 separate times. He had stood at the door 3 times and looked at the road and almost taken it. And then the 4th reason had arrived in August on the Santa Fe line, and he had not stood at the door since. He was not going to stand at the door again. The door was behind him, and the porch was where he was, and Ida was beside him, and the stars were doing what Kansas stars do in autumn, which is to be enormous and unwavering above the flatness of the land in a way that makes the smallness of a single life feel not diminished but contained, held within something large and permanent, which is a different thing entirely. "Look at that," Ida said quietly, tilting her head back to see more of the sky. "I know," he said. They sat there together for a long time, not saying anything more, because they had long since learned that the best things between them did not need saying. They were already said. They were already there in the house with the sleeping children and the account books on the kitchen table and the apple trees in the dark and the cattle in the pasture and the years ahead of them, uncounted and unworried about, because they were going to go through them the same way they had gone through all the years so far, which was together, alongside, staying. The fire inside would still be warm when they went in. The morning would come with its ordinary demands. Pete would arrive, and the cattle would need feeding, and the fence somewhere would need mending, and the accounts would need their weekly attention, and Rose would need the kitchen table for botanical specimens again, and James would need help with something to do with a particular horse that had a particular quality he had not yet found the key to, and Samuel would wake up in the sunny, uncomplicated way he always woke up and want to know what the day was about. And Noah Carson would go inside and sleep beside his wife and wake in the morning to all of it, and it would be enough. It would be more than enough. It would be everything. He had given up on this ranch 3 times and been brought back 3 times by the force of a thing he could not name, until Ida Bell named it for him on a December evening in a blizzard, sitting across the fire with her book open in her lap. Not desperation, not debt, not obligation. Love. Love for the land and the work and the particular shape of a life that was hard and beautiful and his, and finally, completely, because of her, theirs.